I went to Michigan State getting a degree in fisheries and wildlife. I spent a year doing missions work, doing some fish farming. I actually ended up going to Bible school and actually become an ordained minister. I just went through the Christian minister part of it, and that's where I started leading worship. And then I ended up getting married, and really long story. Um, my ex-husband was also in Bible school. Our firstborn son was born with a heart defect, and the doctors missed it. And he basically struggled for his life for 2 weeks, and then did open heart surgery. And then they sent him home in a week. And I was just like a complete wreck trying to take care of this baby that almost died in my care. I was so focused on taking care of Keenan, my son, that I didn't really realize what was going on with him. And, we were pretty new in our marriage. We got pregnant right after we got married. So we didn't have that time where you could get to know each other, without the kids for very long before he was born. My ex-husband started smoking pot, which I never grew up around any of that. Never been part of my story. I've never desired to do drugs or anything like that. And drinking, just not me. When he started smoking pot, he wasn't doing it around me. And so I finally figured out what he was doing, and I like freaked out. I'm like, you can't be in Bible school and smoking pot. Those two things just don't go together. And so I, asked him to go and talk to the pastor, was the dean of the school, thinking that he would, get his heart right and stop doing the drugs. Well, he just stepped down from being in Bible school.
Wow.
And then he switched to taking pills that I wouldn't notice. And then by the time that Keenan was a year old, I was expecting our second son because they're 14 months apart. And my ex husband was a full blown heroin addict.
Oh my goodness.
So, so we went through all kinds of prayer and counseling, and he went through a medical detox. He ended up on methadone treatment. Um, he was just a wreck. I mean, he was selling everything that we had of value to buy drugs. At the time, I wasn't working because I had this baby. I was like, very pregnant, and um, it was a really awful time. I learned a lot in that time. I really didn't want to be divorced. I loved my husband. I love the Lord. I've always loved the Lord, but I just didn't want to break that covenant. And so I did whatever I could to try to get him help. I remember reading in this, I think it's Psalm 15, where it talks about like, who can enter into the mountain of the Lord? He who has clean hands and a pure heart. He who makes a vow and does not break it. Who keeps his word even if it's to his own, hurt. And I really I really went to the Lord in prayer because there were people telling me, you should leave him. So I really, I didn't tell a lot of people. My church women's group, my women's pastor knew, and we were all praying for him and for the situation. And I just really felt like God told me that I should stay and love him. Um, it was hard to do. It wasn't easy because he would go out and do drugs and come back in, and oh, I remember being really, really like really angry, um, and having a really hard time loving him. That struggle, like I know I need to forgive him, but how do you forgive somebody over and over again every single day? Um, but God taught me so much through that. I needed to hear from God what I should do. It would have been easier for me to just leave. It would have been easier for me, like, all right, I'm done. Like, I'm not dealing with any of this because it was awful. He was writing bad checks on my account that I had just added him to because we were married. We had to surrender a vehicle. He just destroyed me financially with all the stuff that he was doing. He stole stuff from the church. Finally, we found a place for him to go, which was Canaan land. It's a It's a it's a Christian year-long in-house program down in Alabama, and he left a week before my second son was born. So I was on my own with these two little babies for an entire year for the delivery. He wasn't there for that. So I went through all that. About 6 months after he'd been in the program, I sold what we had left in Michigan and moved down to Alabama. I didn't know anybody, and so that was also really hard too. But I wanted to be near him. The only time that we could see him really was at church. After a while, he did get like a weekend Saturday visit, for a few hours, but that was pretty much it for an entire year.
Wow.
Um, he got out of the program. He did well. We stayed down in Alabama. We were leading children's ministry at our church and everything, and um, uh, we just weren't making it financially. My daughter was born down there, and I wanted to go back to school and help have a career that would be more conducive to being a mom and helping out the family. And so I wanted to go back to nursing or wanted to go back to school. I wasn't sure if it was nursing or what I was going to do, but I knew that we needed family help um, in order to do that. And so we talked about it and prayed about it. And I was like, "Are you sure you're gonna be okay if we go back home?" And he said, "Oh, I'll be fine." Most of the people that he had been doing drugs with were dead from overdose. So there was only one person left. And when we got back to Michigan, he ended up getting back into everything. He was actually growing poppies and making his own heroin. He wasn't shooting it up that I know of. Um, but long story short, he started abusing pills. He had a seizure while he was driving and plowed into a lady and um, nearly killed her. First, he said he didn't do anything wrong. He wasn't taking drugs at the time, but later he did tell me that he had taken a whole bunch of pills. Anyway, so that led to some big conflicts in our house because he was wanting to take my car then. And there was one night in particular that like I was trying to keep him from taking our car, and he started to get very violent with me. And slam me up against the, lots of stories about that. Finally, we again prayer, counseling with our pastor and with a counselor, and prayer through our church, and um, he finally said he wasn't going to change, and our pastor said, "So what you're saying is that you're choosing drugs over your wife and kids?" And without any hesitation, he was like, "Yep." I was like, just begged him to stop. Just 3 weeks, just stop. Thinking he'll get his head on straight, he'll sober up, he'll realize what he's doing. And the next thing I know, he was growing pot in our basement. I was just done. I can't lose my kids. At that time, I was in nursing school. I'm like, I can't lose my kids and I can't lose my ability to be a nurse. If this gets found out, um, that would be, because my name's on the deed of the house, I could go to jail. We could lose our kids. And so I ended up filing for divorce and turning him in. And it was, it was really just awful because the police came
Hmm.
and pulled out all his growing equipment that he had and put it on the front lawn. And I remember feeling like I was standing out there naked. The neighbors are watching. He had begun saying to me things like, "Well, if God won't give me what I want, there's gods of this world that will give me what I want." So he was doing a 180 with his faith. Um, and then when the police came to arrest him, he said, "This is what your God does." So
Oh, they
he
blamed you.
Yeah, he had started a business, and I would not let him put my name on anything because he had completely destroyed my credit before, and I still didn't trust him completely. Um, so I ended up trying to stay in our house. I went to see him in jail, and he was just ravenously angry and just really scared me. Um, I knew if there hadn't been glass between us, he would have hurt me seriously. his dad actually ended up saying he was going to bail him out, and I was really scared.
I
Um,
bet.
so what ended up happening was I was in the last year of nursing school, last 9 months. I didn't want to leave our house because it was closer to my college. Um, but his dad said he was going to bail him out, and I just packed up my kids, took our necessities, and we left. Um, Thankfully, my sister allowed us to come stay with her, so we weren't like on the street. Um, but then for the next 9 months, I commuted. I think it's over 2 hours. I haven't thought about it in a long time, but you know, I would group my days together so I wouldn't be gone long. And the boys, my two boys, would stay with my sister and her husband, and they would go to school because they were school age. And my youngest, Naomi, was just 3, so she would come with me. I didn't let his parents know, and very few people knew where we were because I didn't know. Like, he got out, he would come after us. Um,
Right.
and so, spent the next several months kind of looking over my shoulder, thinking that he was going to be there. Um, he ended up getting sentenced and put back in jail. Um, and then he got out, and um, things kind of calmed down a bit with him. But anyway, so I finally finished school and still lived on, like, hours away from where he was. Um, Graduated, and we got our own place, and just have continued, being a single mom. That was like, about 15 years ago that all that happened. Kids have had, numerous struggles. The court ordered for them to go every other weekend to stay with him. They knew he was using drugs. They knew all that. I took him. I tried to keep things safe for them, and have their grandma and grandpa were nearby, but it was it's just hard on them, and then finally they all just refused to go. My daughter just turned 18, and my two sons, my oldest is 23, and the next is going to be 22 here soon. So they're all doing well, and so yeah. So I just finished my degree as a nurse practitioner last year.
Wow. That is such an incredible story of triumph, over such a difficult situation. And I love hearing stories like yours, and I can't even imagine continuing to hope that things would get better with him during those years, and seeing that he was making some progress, maybe here a little bit, and he was meeting with the pastor. You're hopeful that it's going to turn out good, and then he's in the detox center, and that seems like it's going well, and he gets out, and then he goes back to it. It seems to be such a common thing for addicts, and such a disillusioning thing for the spouse, because it seems like you keep hoping that this time they're going
Yeah,
to recognize it. And like you said, when he said, "No, I choose drugs over you and the kids." Well, maybe if he just got it out of his system, and then he was thinking clearly again, then he would realize what he's about to lose. Mhm. Seems like a bit of a roller coaster in some ways, and in other ways, it was probably a lot of dark times.
yeah, yeah. I mean, it was not easy. Um, at all. I remember just like there was one time in particular that before I was but just before he went to the rehab, um, you know, Keenan was an infant and I was really pregnant again, and we were at church, and we had some evangelists come through, and I'd seen God move through them and, help people and people's lives being changed. And so I remember we were sitting, near the front of the church, and I remember like it was at the end of the service, and nothing had happened, and I remember just sobbing and being like, God, like, where are you? Why aren't you delivering? And I stopped praying deliver him. I started praying deliver us, because the two become one flesh. Deliver us from this. And he didn't do it. And I just remember being just devastated, just, just so disappointed that God didn't move in the way that I wanted him to. Um, but I since then, like I've had some prayer, like I've been through a lot of counseling to help kind of relearn, because when you're married to an addict, they play with your mind. They lie to you constantly. They make you second guess. They'll be doing drugs and they're doing drugs and you're saying to them, I know you went out and did this. And then they're like, how could you doubt me? How could you doubt my love? And so it's like you're like, wait a second. Like you don't trust your own thoughts. I think this story kind of is the culmination of my trust in God. I grew up in a Christian home. I was one of 8 kids. My parents were always opening their doors to Christian missionaries and evangelists, and we had meetings at our house and Bible studies and praise gatherings. And my parents even had us singing as a family and traveling. We had matching outfits and everything.
Wow.
So I grew up in the church and ever since I was little, like I'd known Christ. And I remember my mom saying prayers with my sister, in the bed next to me, when we were little and talking to her about, having a home in heaven and how to know that you have Jesus in your heart and all that. And I remember like crying out in the dark room, me too, I want to know that Jesus in my heart, I want a home in heaven. And that's when my relationship with Christ began. I went through like an awful breakup when I was in high school. My first love, I fell head over heels in love with this boy, and things had gotten physical and I felt very guilty about that, but nobody knew anything. And then we broke up and I was absolutely devastated. I felt like damaged goods. I felt like nobody would ever love me again. I became super depressed, and I quit eating, and I couldn't sleep at night. I asked my parents if I could go to counseling, and they were like, no, because like back then people didn't go to counseling.
It's hard to find a godly counselor too.
That's right. That's right. And so, I sort of understand, and they were from the era where, people didn't do that. That was, for people that had major problems. Anyway, so, I love my parents dearly, but I could have used some counseling at that point. But anyway, so I just poured myself into the word and I was just like, God, okay, you have my attention. I put this boy in front of you. um, he was more important to me than following you and in loving you by serving you and doing what I know is right. And I was like, I just want to learn whatever you have for me to learn. I want to get out of this pain. I want to get out of this situation. I remember just spending hours reading my Bible and praying and singing, and that's when I really started to worship. God was just moving in my life. I would have like what I feel like is a word of knowledge. My grandma was sick, and I remember I didn't even know she was sick, and I was praying for her and praying that her fever would break. And then my mom's like, Grandma had a fever and it broke yesterday about this time. I was like, wow, that's awesome. I was praying for her right then. And
Wow.
just different things. Like I was like praying for my uncle's eyes. I'm like, why am I praying for Uncle John's eyes? And apparently he was having eye surgery that day. So I just felt like God would give me things to pray for. And it was just, I just felt like we were close. I really thought that if I poured myself into God and sought God with all my heart, the word says it, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. Well, I thought that meant that he was going to bring my boyfriend back and he was going to put my life back together the way I thought it should be. So I was lifeguarding and I was just like so angry. I was like, God, you're not helping me. I remember thinking like, I don't believe in you anymore. Like I have turned my life completely around and sought you with my whole heart, and you are not doing anything for me. my boyfriend's not coming back. Like, I had struggles with my youth pastor, and that wasn't getting resolved. And I remember walking away from where I was sitting, thinking, "There's no God, and I'm not a Christian anymore." And it was so foreign to me because, like I said, I'd known Christ since I was just little, and I remember thinking, "There's
Yes.
no right, there's no wrong. I can do whatever I want. If I wanted to drink and have sex and do drugs, not that I wanted to do that." And I walked away from where I was sitting, like I was physically walking away from God in my heart. And I went and I sat down on this table at the other end of the pool. And no sooner had I sat down, this little lady comes up to me and she says, "I was swimming and God told me to come over here and tell you that he loves you."
Ah, wow. Oh my goodness.
I I hit the floor. I was just just sobbing, like he wouldn't let me go, not for a minute.
Wouldn't let you go.
The minute I was like flailing my arms and, my fists at him, he was speaking to her. And, he's like, "Go tell her." And I was like, "Lady, you have no idea what you've saved me from." Because she didn't know what was going on. But she was like, "I've been praying for you, and I just want you to know that he loves you." And I mean, that was
Oh
pretty
my
much it in our
goodness.
conversation. But I was just like, "Oh my gosh, like, Lord, you are real. You're real." And you love me. From that time on, it was like, "Okay, God, this isn't just something that I learned about in Sunday school or my parents taught me, but you are real and that you absolutely love me and you won't let anything stop um, get in the way from me knowing that." So that's kind of how everything started with me, and really just from there, just growing. I've had struggles on and off, and part of my podcast will be, talking about like the things I had to overcome, like, and the things that God taught me. And, how do you deal with unforgiveness and anger? And, how do you forgive yourself? And how do you hear from God? And like, there's so many aspects of what I went through and the things I had to learn, and then just all the parenting stuff, like, being a single parent and how do you help your kids that are just hurting? And, the very first Christmas that we had, we went to see Santa Claus, and my oldest son asked Santa Claus for a new daddy, and just how do you bind up that kind of wound? So
Right. And they're so young and they're so confused going back and forth, to his home. I'm sure they heard things that were very difficult for them to process. And so can you speak about some of the things that you learned?
one of the biggest things that I learned was about forgiveness. It's not for the other person, it's for you. It's you being right with God. And, you know, the daily, like when he was in the midst of doing drugs and, um, you know, typically it was such a weird time because we actually would have Bible study together like every night, and we'd pray together and I would hear his heart, and that was what I think helped me to stay, um, because I would hear his heart when he was most sober and he was crying out to God for help. But then he would leave. I would go to bed, I'd put the baby to bed, and I would go to sleep, and he would leave, and I would think he was at the house, but many times he would leave and go do drugs and then come back. And I remember like being so angry, um,
Yeah.
just like, God, what do I do with this anger? What do you do
And
with that?
I can imagine it must have been very confusing because you felt the sincerity that he wanted to do this. He did make changes. I mean, there were tangible changes that he made that you saw, and yet the addiction was so strong that he'd be leaving and going to do the drugs. And so it must have been very confusing to you to know which is real. And they're both probably real. Tell us more about that.
I do remember um, one night laying in bed and um, just being so angry. And it's like a depth of anger that I'd never known before. Like I can't explain it other than like feeling like my life had been hijacked. You know, we had been on a path where we were thinking about being in the ministry and ministering to people, and then here we were, with one baby who had almost died, and I was pregnant again, and my husband is skin and bones, and he is using drugs and selling everything we have and is destroying my credit. I don't know if he was even being faithful to me at the time.
Right.
Um, and so, you know, I just remember being so incredibly angry, and it just like, and I literally felt like it was eating me up. And I was really pregnant, and I remember thinking, this cannot be good for my baby. I remember feeling like I was hanging on the side of a cliff by my fingernails, just at the edge. And oh my lord, it was quite something. And I
Hmm.
remember laying in bed one night and being like so angry, and for me, when I get angry, I just kind of fume, to the point where I then start crying, you know. But it takes me a while to get to that point. I fume and fume and fume, and then I'm like, okay. I remember I was crying, and I was like, God, what do I do? And what do I do with this anger? How do I get rid of it? How do I get beyond being so angry?
Hmm.
And I remember just crying out to him and him saying, give it to me. And I was like, give it to you. And my next question to him was, well, then what will I have? Because it was so consuming. It was that sense of control. Like, if I'm angry, if I'm bitter towards him, my ex husband, then I have some sort of control. It's a false sense of control and pride, that like, I'm going to make you do what's right. This is my right to be angry with you because you're doing this to us. And he said, give it to me. And and I said, then what will I have? And he said, brokenness. And I just imagined myself or visualized myself just giving it to him and then receiving that brokenness, and just like scripture like pouring through my mind, like, God is near to the brokenhearted. He gives grace to the humble but resists the proud. And just, God sees that brokenness as beautiful. It's
Yeah.
it's it's in those moments where we are like, okay, I can't do this on my own. I can't make my situation change. This is completely out of my control, and I just surrender it to you. Then it's like he's like, finally, now I can move. And more than anything, he wasn't going to be moving to change my husband, but he was moving to change me, you know?
Oh, wow. That is so profound.
And it was still hard. It was still a struggle, and it was still a daily like laying it down. But I had to trust that God had a plan. And even after everything that we went through, I would always say to my kids, like, nothing happens in our life without God knowing, and He has a purpose for everything. I love the story of Joseph and all the things that he went through and endured, the false accusations and the imprisonment and being sold into slavery and hated by his siblings, which is like, man, that would just be awful.
Yeah.
And at the end, his brothers were like, Dad said you're not supposed to hold this against us. If you've ever read the end of that story, it's like they
I
come to him
love
like,
it.
they're worried that he's gonna like retaliate after their dad's gone, and it's like, Dad said you have to
Yeah.
forgive us, basically. And he's just like heartstricken. He's just like, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And that, I mean, that to me, like, I guess with everything I've been through, that's the one thing that I take comfort in is that, and I say to my kids all the time, like, no matter what happens, no matter what we go through, God uses it all. Our supposed poor choices, our bad decisions, our mistakes, like he weaves them into his tapestry of goodness and his beautiful plan for our lives. Nothing's wasted. Nothing is nothing is beyond his use, and I just love that about him. I just love the fact that even though the worst and the most tragic situations, he is able to just turn those and make such beauty from our ashes.
Oh my goodness, you are quoting some of my favorite scriptures. I love that scripture about God creating beauty from ashes in Isaiah, and I love that part about. I mean, it's all highlighted in my scriptures too about how they meant it for evil, but God turned it for good. And in Romans, where He says all things work together for good to those that love God. That's probably another one of your favorite.
Yes.
I just I celebrate that with you that you were able to hold on to that truth because that's really hard when you're hurting so deeply and you're feeling that betrayal and the rejection, to feel God's love for you, to feel hope and faith that He will turn this for good. I just celebrate this with you. This is so amazing. I'm just in awe. So when your kids are struggling and they haven't gone through the same thing where they have that same strength of faith, and they probably, they hear you say that, well, it's all going to work to our good, or the suffering wasn't in vain. But they're thinking, but this, my reality hurts so bad. And I can imagine there've been a lot of difficult things that your kids have gone through.
Yeah. Um, they've each struggled in their own way. Um, my oldest ended up um, for a time doing drugs, and he ran away. And so, like, the
Mm.
people that were my support system actually were like, we can't handle this. And so I was alone with my dealing with my son running away and trying to find him and bring him back home. And in the meantime, my second son was like, I'm not going to stay in the same house with him because he was really mad at what his brother had done and the drama that he was causing. And the boys were literally going to beat each other up. And I was working nights, and it was such a mess.
Wow. Oh,
So,
gracious. Oh my
I
goodness.
mean,
And to be alone, to not have those those family members that you were counting on so much.
yeah. So um, I remember just laying out before the Lord and just praying. Like, I mean, what do you do? And I finally find Keenan and got him. I was going to bring him back home, and his brother's like, "I'm not going to be here with him." My kids have seen along the way how God has provided for us. I remember, like, um, when we were living with my sister. I haven't even graduated from my nursing program, and it was near the end of May, and my job didn't start, I think, until like the end of June or beginning of July. Um, and she said, "All right, I want you guys to be moved out before the Memorial Day weekend." And I remember thinking, okay, like, I don't even have a job yet. Where am I going to go? And we weren't like at odds or anything. She just asked me to leave by then. And I remember thinking, okay, well, I can't really complain because she's let us live here this whole time without paying anything. So God just worked everything out. And I found a nice townhouse, and it was perfect for us. That next weekend, there was a horrible rainstorm, and my sister's basement flooded. And had she not, you know, said, you need to be out by this time, if I would have protested and said, give us a few more weeks or, whatever, then all of our stuff would have been destroyed because it was all in the
Mm.
basement.
Oh my,
So so they've seen it. They know. I've always said to them, nothing happens just by happenstance. There's no such thing as coincidence. God uses everything. We just have to trust him. Um, and they struggled at school. It was a Christian community, but it's very legalistic. I had moms telling me, Christian moms, that I was in a Bible study with, telling me that they wouldn't let their kids play with other kids from broken homes. Um,
Oh,
I was, and I was basically like, people just would not talk to me because I was divorced.
oh,
So,
wow.
so that was challenging. Um,
Yes.
and my kids, they got teased. They've all turned out well. I've said to them that, I've commended all of them because of what they've gone through. It's made all of them so much more compassionate. Every single one of them. I say they kind of find strays. They find the people that are hurting, the people that nobody else notices, and those are the people that they reach out to. Those are the people that they befriend. Um, and it's such a blessing to me to see their hearts and their their desire to help others and their sense of like I guess their sense of fairness. And they're really like passionate about what's fair and what's not fair and how kids should be treated and not treated. I had
Yeah.
so yeah, so all of them notice people that are hurting and they reach out to them, and I love that about all of them. They're
Ah,
each
that's so beautiful.
mhm.
I was going to ask you, I've known I've known several people that have gone through situations like this where they're praying and praying, for help that God will deliver them and help the person, feel the spirit in their life and be moved to change and things. But they feel like God is not mindful of them. What advice would you give to them?
I struggled with that for a long time after the divorce. And, I really thought even after the divorce that he would get better. Um, and, and it didn't happen. I had to really kind of reconcile that in that couple things. God doesn't, he gives us a free will. And even though, my heart was softened to God's um, calling and God's beckoning me to forgive and to seek after Him. He's a gentleman. He's not gonna make somebody love Him. He's not gonna make somebody make the right decisions. I also think that there was a time when my ex-husband, he did find freedom, but he didn't know how to keep it.
Right.
And so he ended up going back out to it a couple times. So after he got out of the rehab, I mean, he was radiant and healthy and at peace. And then he, little by little, he went back to it. His heart wasn't um, open to God's calling and God's leading and repentant. And like I said, God's a gentleman. He's not going to force His way in anyone's life. The other thing too is I heard Beth Moore speak about this. There's a passage in Scripture where John the Baptist is in prison. He's basically on death row, and and he sends his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the Messiah, or is there someone else that we should be looking for?" And here's John the Baptist, the one that said, this is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Like, follow him. He was baptizing people, and then he saw the dove descend upon Jesus and say, "This is my beloved son. Listen to him." Like he was there for all of that. But yeah, he's doubting because he's like, well, if you are God, then why am I still on death row? Why aren't you doing anything? So sort of like that same situation that I was in, not nearly as dramatic. I wasn't on death row, but I was like, God, why aren't you doing anything? Like, if you're
Right.
God, the God that I know can do anything. He can move mountains. He can save people. He can heal people. He can deliver people. Why not for me? Why not now?
Mhm.
And just like John the Baptist, he asking Jesus, "Are you the Messiah? Like, what gives? Like, why are you helping me?" And
Yeah.
Jesus says to John's disciples, he says, "Tell John this is what I'm doing. I'm healing the sick. I'm curing the lame. Blessed is he who is not offended in me." Basically, he's like, "Yes, I'm the Messiah, but I'm not always going to do things the way that you think. I'm more interested in your relationship with me than I am with your comfort. God must have a reason." And, for me and what happened with my husband, I don't understand it, but I do trust that God does have a purpose in it. Like, here I am, I'm sharing my story of God's goodness, even in the midst of trial, even in the midst of all this horrible stuff that happened. Um, and I want to give people hope that, just because things don't turn out the way you want them to. I've been a nurse for a long time, and I've seen people, young people pass away. I've seen, parents lose their kids, young people lose their parents. I've been at the bedside when people are saying goodbye to their loved ones, um, and, been there when people have nobody else, and they're passing away. And so, like, death isn't the end of the story. And, you know, this is just temporary. What God has for us is so much more glorious and so much more mind blowing, than what we have here. Our relationships the people that we can touch, the people that we can, point to Jesus. Those will be our crowns.
So do you have any other like stories in the scriptures that give you strength to be able to keep trusting in his plan? Um, um, do you have any other examples in the scriptures like that give you hope?
My life isn't easy. Even now, I struggle with, like, I'm working at a place that's an hour away. And so I'm driving an hour there and an hour back. And now it's snowing out. And I'm like, Lord, I thought we would be working closer to home. Hired someone to help me build an addition on my house. And they, took me for a big down payment and didn't come back. So, stuff like that. So I'm like, Lord, I thought I heard from you. Thought this person was reputable. I did my due diligence and checked their references and even saw things that they built. And, so stuff like that. So that's frustrating,
Yeah.
but then here's my lesson, like, forgive, let it go. You know, my God shall supply all my needs according to his riches and glory in Christ Jesus. The scriptures to me are like, they are bread and life to me. God's real. There's a power struggle going on in our world. The kingdom of heaven and the kingdom of darkness, and sometimes God allows stuff to happen that doesn't make sense. We can pray and pray and pray, but ultimately God is in control. We can trust him. We may not like his decisions. We might not like the path that he leads us on.
You've strengthened my faith hearing
Oh,
you tell about your favorite scriptures, and those are my favorite scriptures too. And then to hear, just all that you've gone through and how you have trusted in God through that and wrestled with God to be able to trust in him. Thank you so much. I have loved hearing your thoughts today. I echo so much of what you have to say. I'm fascinated with the resonance that I feel from you. I really relate to so much of what you have felt and the just the way that you have felt God's hand in your life and so thank you. I'm so edified by hearing your story today. So thank you so much. Ah, that was just beautiful. That was just really, really beautiful.